thanks so much for doing this. We'll give this minute or two to let
Mhm.
people join, but I'm thrilled to have you back on the show, Yaroslav.
Great to be back.
So you're coming to me from Kyiv?
No, I'm actually in New York City now.
Okay, on the book tour.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, we'll talk about that. So just give it maybe one or two more minutes to see if other
Mhm.
people join. But again, thanks. I'm looking forward to this. So, Yaroslav, you are like one of the most prolific writers I have ever encountered. You wrote the definitive book last year
Mhm.
on Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the war in Ukraine. You're pumping out article after article for the Wall Street Journal, and now you have a novel being published very soon this month, right?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Well, the timing could not have been better. What's the novel about? Tell us about it.
Well, it's called No Country for Love, and it's really a novel that is based on my grandmother's life in Ukraine in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, which was really the probably the deadliest place on earth at the time, and between the artificial famine that killed millions, then the purges, the Nazi invasion, the Holocaust, the war, and then after the war, the insurgency that lasted for almost a decade in Ukraine, while the rest of Europe was returning to peaceful life. And though it's a fiction book, it's a novel. It's really based on real events, and especially when it comes to the secondary characters, to sort of everything that's happening around her, and I try to be as faithful as possible. And you say I'm prolific. It actually took me 8 years to write this book.
Hmm.
I started writing it in 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine, and I was living in Kabul in Afghanistan. I was running our the Wall Street Journal's Afghanistan and Pakistan coverage, and I traveled a lot in Ukraine and Russia to research locations, look at the archives. And I finished this novel in 2022, in January 2022, just before the full-scale Russian invasion. And it was really eerie because I was describing in the book, the scenes of destruction in Kiev and Kharkiv during the Second World War. And all of a sudden, just a few months after I finished that book, I saw it in real life. Uh, you know, uh, as Russia actually invaded Ukraine that year.
That's incredible. So it tells more or less a fictionalized version of your grandmother's story. Is that right?
Yes, correct. So
Okay.
it's based on the real story of my family, my grandmother. Her name was Deborah, and but it's not a very unique story because so many other people in Ukraine had gone through similarly harrowing circumstances.
Hmm.
Nearly half the population of Ukraine died in those decades between the famine and the war,
Yeah.
and so everyone in Ukraine today is a descendant of the survivors of that meat
Yeah.
grinder of history. Uh, and we all carry with us these family stories that were hidden in the Soviet times because telling
Yes.
the truth was banned, and that really explains why Ukraine is resisting today
Yeah.
because you know people know how dark this past was, and to them, a return to Russian rule would also mean the return to this horrors. And so, I think the calculation
Yeah.
that many are making is that it's better to sustain whatever pain there is now than to return to a much more tragic past that existed before.
Well, I'm alive today because my family left. My grandfather left
Mhm.
Ukraine in the 1920s with his
Exactly.
family. So that's how we're able to have this conversation. Let's talk about Ukraine today. And I'm really excited for your book. Congratulations
Thank
on
you.
its forthcoming publication tomorrow. I'll post a link to it in the show notes when this gets published as an episode of Global Dispatches podcast. But let's talk about Ukraine today because there is just a lot happening on the
Mhm.
diplomatic front this week and potentially next week as well. But I'd love to just kind of take a step back and have you set the context for what what are the contours of the war in Ukraine today? Where do things stand on the battlefield? Can you just kind of catch listeners up to where the front lines are and what some of the major events over the last several months have been in terms of the actual fighting on the ground?
Well, the front lines are kind of where they were a year ago. That's the thing. So there's a lot of fighting. There is a lot of death and destruction. And Russia, while it's been on the offensive for the last year and a half, and losing tens and tens of thousands of people, they haven't really had that much to show for. They've seized a few small towns in the Donbass. They've advanced a little bit in the Kharkiv region. They have not been able to expel Ukrainian forces that have occupied a part of Russia's Kursk region since August last year, and they're still there, despite the infusion of North Korean troops there, despite this massive expenditure in ammunition and missiles. So Ukraine is losing ground, but very, very slowly. And as it is doing that, it is really destroying the Russian capabilities to wage war further.
Hmm.
So both sides are
That's fascinating.
tired.
Can I just kind of stop you there because it's
Yeah,
fascinating because while the trajectory, as you described, is like slow Russian gains,
yeah.
in fact, the slowness of their gains is degrading Russia's ability to continue to wage war. And you just saw, for example, you mentioned the North Korean troops. As
Mhm.
far as the reporting I've seen, which comes from you and others, troops are no longer online. They've been basically massacred and killed and repelled.
Well, I mean, they've come back. So they were pulled back from the front line after sustaining thousands of casualties. I think retrained, and they're now using different tactics, hoping for more success. Bottom line is that they've been there for several months now, and the Ukrainian troops are still in the Kursk region of Russia. At the same time, what Ukraine has been doing in all this time is developing its ability to strike deep inside Russia with missiles, with drones, and that is real pain. Almost every night there is a refinery or a military facility, hundreds of miles, sometimes thousands of miles, more than 1,000 miles away from the border, that is being struck. And so that kind of pain in the Russian rear, if you will, and sort of be well away from the front lines, was not really happening a year ago, 2 years
Mm.
ago. So that's also a new development in the war.
And that's a consequence of the Biden administration's decision to permit the use of those long range, like so-called attackums deep
No, not
into
really.
no.
No, not really. I mean, the ATACMS are not really long range. The range of the ATACMS is about 100 miles, maybe a little bit more, and they use is very circumscribed to border areas, and in terms of
Mm.
targets, very limited. And also, there's not that many of them. Now, it's the result of Ukraine really growing its own military industries, its ability to make its own drones. Ukraine was a major military sort of weapons manufacturer and exporter before this war. It had, and also major aircraft export. Ukraine had the Soviet Union's biggest aircraft engine factory in Zaporizhia. It manufactured Antonov planes, so it has the talent and the capacity to make these things by itself, and it shows now because most of the strikes deep inside Russia are with Ukrainian-made drones and missiles now, because Ukraine also makes its own missiles.
So, if the general status of the conflict right now is one in which Russia is making slow gains, but doing so very
Mhm.
painfully, um, there is of recent, days really a
Mhm.
seeming um I wouldn't call it like a flurry of diplomatic activity, but there are moves on the diplomatic front as a consequence of the new United States administration, the new Trump administration coming to office. He's appointed Keith Kellogg, a
Mhm.
former military general who's like 80 years old, to be the point person on Ukraine peace talks. What do we know thus far about how Keith Kellogg has comported himself? What has he been saying? Like, what do we know about any contours of a potential Trump peace plan? And I'm using kind of air quotes here for those who are listening and not watching.
Yeah.
What might emerge?
Well, so far it's all very vague, and I think the issue is very simple. For Russia, any Ukrainian state that is independent would be a loss for the war. I mean, what Putin wants is not Donbass. He doesn't want some territory in the east or in the south. What Russia has wanted since the very beginning is the elimination of the Ukrainian state as an independent state. So they want Kiev, they want everything. And that's not something even the Trump administration would be willing to give the Russians. And so that leaves a very big gap between the positions of two sides. And General Kellogg, I've spoken to General Kellogg. He knows Ukraine. He understands Ukraine. His daughter works in Ukraine with an NGO. But ultimately, the decision making will be in the White House. It will be President Trump who will decide on what kind of deal he would be ready to strike. So it's quite clear that Russia is not going to withdraw from occupied areas of Ukraine anytime soon. And it occupies about 20% of Ukraine, including Crimea and the parts of Donbass that were taken 10 years ago, 2014. Well, almost 11 years ago. So the question is, what guarantees will Ukraine have that if the fighting is stopped, if there is a ceasefire, that it's not just going to be used by Russia to rearm, regroup, and go for another bite down the line? And that's a huge issue because what Russia has demanded in all its talks until now is basically a disarmament of Ukraine. Ukraine that would surrender its long-range weapons, that would cut its armed forces down to the bone, and would not be able to really resist another Russian incursion. And that's not something Ukraine will accept. And so the other issue is obviously, who would police that deal.
Mhm.
And Vice President Vance has indicated that the U.S. is not interested in directly getting itself involved. So it's the Europeans who would have to do it.
Well, that's interesting. I did see that there is this kind of idea out there that European peacekeepers, if there is some sort of, cessation of hostilities, it would be European peacekeepers potentially that would be helping to guarantee the security of Ukraine by having like boots on the ground. How are European diplomats and uh, governments approaching that question?
Well, I mean, there is no military power in Europe that could make a difference in Ukraine. Let's be realistic.
Mm,
Ukraine has maybe the second, if Ukraine were a member of NATO today, it would have the second, maybe the third largest military force, and certainly the only one that has been tested in combat.
mhm,
Ukraine has 1 million soldiers and Marines and sailors in its armed forces. The size of the British Army is about 80,000, maybe less. So none of those countries really has the capacity to field anything other than a tripwire to those areas. And the tripwire is kind of pointless if there is no US guarantee behind it, because
mm,
who's going to extend a nuclear umbrella over all of this? And so, the Ukrainians are very concerned that without an American backing, at least not necessarily American boots on the ground, but some kind of American promise to intervene in case things really deteriorate, any guarantee will be meaningless. And let's remember that the previous two agreements, Minsk One and Minsk Two, that supposedly ended the fighting in Ukraine in 2014, 2015, were guaranteed by France and Germany, but nothing came out of it.
mhm. So this all seems to leave Zelensky in a really tough position right now. I mean, he has like a very fraught relationship with Donald Trump. Vladimir Putin just like wants to kill him. So he seems to like be in a very tough position if Trump tries to like impose a
Mhm.
peace deal, which might happen. Like, what are the conversations in Kiev right now about how Zelensky may navigate that?
Well, look, I mean, if you are losing territory, which Ukraine is right now, you're kind of interested in stopping the fighting, right? Because the dynamic of the war is going against you right now. So Ukraine is not against ending the war, against stopping the fighting. Question is what next? And I think the level of casualties is very high. The level of fatigue in Ukraine is very high. It's been 3 years of war, and so there would be a degree of public support for Zelensky to freeze the conflict, as long as it doesn't mean that it's just a pause before an even bigger war in which Ukraine would be defenseless.
Mhm,
So the question of guarantees, the question of further military aid for Ukraine, the question of rebuilding the Ukrainian army, all of that is fundamental, more important actually than the territory. And here again, we have Russia that is very openly saying today, that the Russian the head of Russia's ruling party, Dmitry Medvedev, who is a former president, kind of was a
mhm,
stand-in for Putin, and he's still one of the top decision makers in Russia. He very clearly said, as recently as in December, that for Ukrainians have to stop considering themselves different from the Russians. And if they will persist in their arrogant idea that they're not Russians, then there will be no Ukraine. We'll wipe it out.
Mhm.
So I think the intent of Russia has not changed, and that's the big crux, because they would not accept any deal that ties their hands in the future.
Well, I mean, how much trepidation is there in Kyiv right now that Trump will seek to impose a deal by threatening to withhold arms or future arms sales to Ukraine, while at the same time not offer that security guarantee that you describe as so central to, like, Ukraine's future?
I mean, there is trepidation. There is trepidation, obviously, but you know, Trump doesn't hold the keys to everything here. Remember what happened at the beginning when Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago? The Biden administration just stood aside and let them do it. They evacuated the embassy. They gave Ukraine no meaningful military assistance. The weapons were limited. I think Ukraine received 90 javelins, against thousands and thousands of Russian tanks, armored vehicles. And it's only after Ukraine turned the tide on its own, with its own weapons, with its own soldiers, with very limited assistance in the first few months of the war, that the spigot was opened, and very,
Mhm,
you know, reluctantly and with great delays, more and more sophisticated weapons started flowing from the U.S.
mhm,
So, the Ukrainians are not just going to roll over and surrender and kind of, sign away their country because President Trump tells them to.
mhm. Um, yeah, I mean the will to fight, obviously, for their existence is still there, no matter the degree of U.S. support. It would seem, and that's something we've heard from the beginning.
Right, and
Um,
that's where history is very important, because I think people abroad don't really understand how tragic the Ukrainian history was and how central a role it plays in this conflict. Because it all started with President Putin writing a big historical essay, 6 months before the full-scale invasion, saying, Ukraine is Russia. Ukrainians and Russians are one people. And the very first thing that Russians do when they occupy a Ukrainian town is that they bulldoze the monument to the victims of the famine of the 1930s, the Holodomor, and they say it never happened. And they glorify, the executioners of those times who were, murdering wholesale Ukrainian intellectuals whose memory was wiped out until Ukraine's independence. And so all that on the other side is also very well known by the new Ukrainian generation that rediscovered its history, that was taught what happened last time the Russians were in charge in, over the past 30 years, of independence. And I think that's really that memory is really what motivates people to keep fighting and keep fighting.
mhm. And let's just like plug your new novel once again, which tells the story
Yeah,
that you just described, and presumably is part of an effort to keep that history, keep that memory alive.
yeah. I
Um,
mean,
yeah,
this novel is kind of like a prequel to the current events, because I think it's
mhm,
really, it's really hard to understand the determination of Ukrainians despite all these odds. I mean, look, they're fighting a nuclear superpower that is several times larger, with much bigger resources. And that then for 3 years they refused to back down. Losing so many young people in their prime, having the cities destroyed, because they know that under Russian rule it will be worse. If they
mhm.
surrender, there will be more death and more destruction, because that's what Ukrainian history tells them.
So, can I ask you about Zelensky's political position right now? Now,
Yeah.
there ought to be elections coming up. They probably won't be because Ukraine is still under a state of martial law and they're just not capable of carrying out free and fair elections. But his political position seems to be somewhat precarious right now. And he has a challenger in Zelensky, the general, the current ambassador to Ukraine, to the United Kingdom, but someone who was a key general that Zelensky let go a couple of years ago. Um, like, how are like what's the general sort of feeling towards Zelensky right now? How solid is his political position, and like what portends for the future in terms of elections or not?
Well, I mean, his term expired last year, and but under Ukrainian law, you're not allowed to have elections during a war. And the state of emergency, it's not just been proclaimed; it's been renewed by Parliament in a due parliamentary vote every 3 months. And let's remember, in the United Kingdom, one of the world's oldest democracies, also did not have any elections during World War II. The Parliament just kept, prolonging its own mandate. And if you look at the Ukrainian history during independence, Zelensky is the sixth president of Ukraine, and only one of the six was reelected to the second term. And Ukrainians don't really like to re-elect incumbents usually. So yes, his position is perhaps precarious, but the challengers to him, like General Zaluzhny, who's in London and is his ambassador, or the former president Petro Poroshenko, right now are potential challengers. None of them is calling for elections. Actually, they all say no, we cannot have elections during a war.
Mhm.
So none of them is challenging Zelensky now, but there will be a campaign and a discussion after the war ends. And if you look again at the British example, Prime Minister Churchill lost an election after winning World War II. So the thing in Ukraine is that Zelensky is really the face of Ukraine to people in the West because he's done such a good job speaking for Ukraine and explaining the Ukrainian fight. But people in Ukraine are not fighting for Zelensky. I mean, he just happens to be the president, but they're fighting for their independence. It's
Mhm.
very, it's not a political fight; it's an existential war.
Um, can I just shift gears a little bit and ask
Mhm.
you about, the big kind of story that I've been following, across the world is the impact of the US foreign aid freeze and the shuttering
Yeah.
of USAID. I mean, and it's having reverberating consequences really like almost every corner of the globe, everywhere that
Yeah.
US foreign policy touches. And of course, that includes Ukraine. Like, how is this foreign aid freeze and the shuttering of USAID being felt in Ukraine right now? What impact is it having, if at all?
I mean, it's having an impact because obviously Ukraine is one of the biggest recipients of USAID funding, but military aid is not being affected. So military
Hmm.
aid is still flowing, so it doesn't have a direct impact on the fighting. It has an impact on things like war crimes investigations, for example, because they were funded through USAID, and those people no longer have the funding. But the U.S. is not the only country fighting Ukraine. The Europeans are providing more money to Ukraine than the U.S. And they are stepping in to fill some of these gaps.
Mm. So that's interesting. Okay, so Europe is stepping in because Europe, as you said, was actually like a larger funder on the non-military side of things to
Well,
start
I
with.
think overall, actually, Europe
Okay.
right now overall is a larger funder than the U.S. on the non-military side, but also like in terms of actual money on the military side as well.
Mhm. So I can't ask you to like predict the future,
Mhm.
but next week or later this week actually is the Munich Security Conference,
Yes.
and there is a lot of talk that it is in the context of the Munich Security Conference that the Trump administration will reveal its peace plan. And again, I'll use like air quotes here. Like, what is the kind of the thinking going into this Munich Security Conference? What are you looking forward to? What are you looking towards? What's just kind of like the general, I guess, vibe around Ukraine and in diplomatic circles as we're headed into this potentially major announcement?
Well, I don't know if there will be a peace plan in Ukraine on Ukraine in Munich. So Secretary Rubio is going there. Vice President Vance is going there for his first meeting with the European leaders. Even before that, he'll meet some of them in Paris. And this is kind of the first acquaintance, I guess, of the new Trump team with the leadership of European NATO members. And President Zelensky will also be there. President Zelensky may after that come to Washington to meet President Trump. Who knows? Right now, every side is really keeping their cards very close to the chest, and I don't see any indication that a deal is imminent. But you never know.
Yeah. Let's take a moment to see if anyone in the audience has a question before I let you go. I'm really looking forward to. So first of all, let me just plug your nonfiction book published last year.
Mhm.
Absolutely, I loved it. It
Thank
was
you.
just the best documentation of uh, the war in Ukraine that I have read. It just really enriched me, and I'm really looking forward to your novel as well. I don't read novels, but Yaroslav, I'll make an exception for you, sir.
Well, it's a documentary novel. I mean, the everything that is not the actual life story of the main protagonist, which is sometimes fictionalized, everything else is very documentary and journalistic and documented. So if you want to learn about what really happened to Ukraine in those darkest decades of the 20th century, I mean that's a very accessible way of doing it. And I'm trying to be very lively because it's a love story, it's a murder mystery, but you have all of that sauce around it.
Well, good luck and congratulations, and good luck on the book launch tomorrow. I'm really
Thank
looking
you.
forward to it.
Thank you,
All
Mark.
right. Okay. All right. Well, so we can wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Yaroslav.
Thank you, Mark. Great being on the
All right.
show.
Bye.